Welcome to a journey through time. A journey to the blood-soaked sands of the Roman Colosseum where not all battles were fair and not all victories were earned. The Colosseum is often remembered as a grand stage of heroism and courage. Animal hunts, the beasts had no chance. The Colosseum was not only a place where men fought men. It was also a stage where men fought animals, or more precisely, where men slaughtered animals in spectacles that were neither fair nor honorable. The Venetians, the animal hunts were among the most popular forms of entertainment. The Romans imported wild beasts from across their vast empire, lions from North Africa, elephants from India, bears from the forests of Gaul, and crocodiles from the Nile. Each beast was paraded before the crowd as an exotic prize, yet none of these animals ever stood a chance. Many of these creatures were starved, drugged, or maimed before entering the arena. Sometimes they were chained to prevent them from escaping. Sometimes they were blinded to ensure they could not defend themselves. The contests were illusions of bravery, but in truth, they were staged massacres. We follow the story of Marcus, a young Roman hunter who had spent his life in the forest but was recruited to the Colosseum for his skill in tracking and killing animals. At first, Marcus was proud. He believed he was honoring the empire, showcasing his talents. But as he stepped into the arena for his first public hunt, something felt wrong. Marcus faced a lion that had been caged for weeks, barely able to walk from starvation. The beast's ribs protruded under its matted fur. The crowd roared with excitement. But Marcus hesitated. Where was the honor in this? Where was the challenge? As Marcus continued to perform in the Colosseum, he encountered more animals: a blind elephant, a wounded bear, a sedated tiger. Each time, the audience celebrated his skill, but inside Marcus grew hollow. He realized he was not a hunter. He was an executioner. The Colosseum used animals to showcase the emperor's reach. By displaying creatures from distant lands, Rome reminded its citizens that the empire ruled the known world. The death of each animal was a performance of conquest, a visual confirmation that nothing could stand against Rome, not even nature itself, but the animals suffered greatly. The story of Lucia, a slave girl assigned to care for the animals before the games, offers another perspective. Lucia witnessed the cruelty behind the scenes. She saw lions beaten to enrage them, tigers starved until they could barely stand, and leopards dragged by chains as they fought to escape. One day, Lucia found a small lion cub born in captivity, destined for the arena. She secretly fed and cared for the cub, naming him Aleus. As the cub grew, Lucia realized his fate was inevitable. When the day came for Aleus to be sent into the arena, she made a desperate choice. Under cover of night, Lucia smuggled Aleus out of the holding pens and led him through the underground tunnels beneath the Colosseum. She knew the punishment if she were caught would be death. With the help of a sympathetic guard, she released Aleus into the countryside, far from the reach of the games. Lucia's act was one of rare compassion in a place built on cruelty. Her story, whispered among the servants and animal keepers, became a symbol of quiet rebellion against the merciless system. But for most animals, escape was impossible. In grand exhibitions, entire herds of animals were slaughtered in single events. During the inauguration of the Colosseum, Emperor Titus reportedly ordered the killing of over 9,000 animals in a single day. The sands of the arena turned to mud from the mix of blood and dust. The audience cheered as the beasts fell, but not all spectators celebrated. There were Romans who began to question the morality of the games. Philosophers like Seneca and Pliny the Elder wrote of their discomfort, warning that the cruelty of the spectacles eroded the soul of the empire. Marcus, the hunter, eventually could no longer endure his role. He retired from the games and retreated to the forests of his youth, but the images of the helpless animals haunted him for the rest of his life. He began writing about his experiences, not as grand tales of conquest, but as confessions of guilt and pleas for compassion. One of his writings, a simple line, was found preserved centuries later. "I once stood as a hero in the Colosseum, but I was no hero. I was a butcher in the theater of lies." The Romans crafted elaborate spectacles to create the illusion of bravery, but the truth was far more brutal. The animals were not adversaries. They were victims. Consider the story of the Ethiopian giraffe, a creature never before seen in Rome. When it was presented in the Colosseum, the crowd was initially in awe. But the spectacle demanded death, not admiration. The giraffe was released into the arena with hunters ordered to kill it for sport. Its long, elegant neck offered no defense. The crowd watched as the animal, bewildered and terrified, was struck down. The Colosseum was not about fairness. It was about domination. The Venetians evolved into more grotesque spectacles. Sometimes men dressed in absurd costumes, pretending to be mythological heroes, would slay animals in choreographed displays. Other times, animals were pitted against each other, lions against elephants, bears against bulls in contests where suffering was inevitable. Behind the grandeur, the reality was always the same. The animals never stood a chance. The underground tunnels of the Colosseum, known as the Hypogeum, became infamous for their cages and holding cells. Animals were crammed into dark, stifling chambers, sometimes for days, awaiting their brutal fate. The stench of blood, fear, and decay hung heavy in the air. Lucia, after saving Aelius, continued to work among these tunnels. She began to sabotage the games, loosening chains, hiding weapons, and quietly releasing smaller animals when she could. Her resistance was subtle but powerful. Over time, her story became legend among the animal keepers, who started to leave small food offerings in hidden corners, honoring the spirit of the lion cub she had saved. Even the crowd, addicted to the thrill of the hunt, began to tire of the endless slaughter. As the Roman Empire began its slow decline, the appetite for such spectacles diminished. Some emperors, seeking public favor, reduced the number of animal hunts, while others doubled down on the bloodshed to reassert their power. Yet the stories of Marcus, Lycia, and even the animals themselves survived in the quiet corners of history. The Colosseum, a monument to human ambition and cruelty, stands today as a relic of those ancient performances. The sand is gone. The cages are empty, but if you listen closely, some say you can still hear the distant roar of lions, the clatter of gates, and the echoes of a crowd that once demanded blood. The beasts had no chance. But their stories, like the stories of the men and women who defied the system, continue to resonate. Chapter 3. Gladiators versus prisoners. The gladiator games were brutal. But there was one type of match that exposed the deepest cruelty of the Colosseum, when trained gladiators faced untrained, unarmed prisoners. These battles were never meant to be fair. They were staged to crush the spirit of rebellion and showcase the dominance of Rome. Gladiators trained for years in specialized schools called ludi. They honed their combat skills, learned the art of survival, and lived within a strict code. Some gladiators became famous, celebrated as sportsmen and heroes. But the prisoners they faced in the arena had no such training, no such glory, and no real chance of survival. These prisoners were often captured rebels, runaway slaves, and those sentenced to death. Some had never held a weapon. Others were injured, starved, or emotionally broken long before they ever stepped onto the sand. The Roman audience loved these mismatched battles. They delighted in the one-sided slaughter, and the emperors used these games to remind the public that all who defied Rome would meet the same fate. One such prisoner was Darius, a farmer from a small village accused of sheltering runaway slaves. He was dragged to Rome and condemned to die in the Colosseum. His opponent was a seasoned gladiator named Brutus, a man whose reputation as a ruthless killer thrilled the crowd. Darius was given a wooden club and a battered shield with a broken strap. Brutus, in contrast, was armed with a gleaming sword and full armor. The crowd jeered, placing bets on how quickly Brutus would finish the fight. But Brutus hesitated. As he looked into Darius' terrified eyes, he remembered his own past. Brutus had once been a prisoner too, forced into gladiatorial training after being captured in battle. He knew the terror Darius felt, the hopelessness of standing before a trained killer. In a shocking act of defiance, Brutus refused to strike. He dropped his sword and turned to the emperor, shouting that he would no longer participate in the slaughter of the helpless. The crowd fell silent, unsure of how to react. The emperor's signal was swift. Guards rushed in, and Brutus was executed on the spot. Brutus' rebellion was rare, but not unique. Throughout the history of the games, there were moments when gladiators defied the system, choosing honor over cruelty. Some were inspired by personal guilt, others by solidarity with the prisoners who were never meant to leave the arena alive. But most gladiators complied. Their own survival depended on pleasing the crowd and the emperor. Mercy was punished. Brutality was rewarded. Consider the story of Septimus. a young gladiator whose rise to fame was built on the blood of prisoners. At first, he convinced himself that they were criminals, that they deserved their fate. But over time, the hollow victories haunted him. He began to see the faces of those he killed in his dreams. One day, he faced a prisoner named Aishi, a woman accused of aiding a slave revolt. She was offered no armor, no shield, just a short dagger with a chipped blade. The crowd roared for blood. Septimus stood over her, his sword poised, but Asha did not cower. She stared at Septimus, unblinking, her gaze steady. In that moment, something changed in him. He lowered his sword and offered her his shield. Together, they fought off the guards who rushed into the arena to punish them both. Their resistance was brief. They were captured and executed, but their defiance became a whispered legend among the gladiators and the slaves. The practice of pitting gladiators against prisoners was not just about entertainment, it was political theater. The Roman elite wanted the public to see their enemies, real or imagined, utterly humiliated and destroyed. The prisoners were forced to fight for the amusement of the people who condemned them. There were no rules to protect the prisoners. Sometimes they were sent to the arena completely unarmed, told to run from wild animals before being cut down by gladiators. Other times, they were given weapons that were sabotaged to break on impact. The games were staged to make sure the prisoners lost. The underground cells where the prisoners waited were damp, dark, and suffocating. Many spent their final hours listening to the roar of the crowd above. Knowing that soon it would be their turn to step into the arena, there were moments of rare compassion. Some gladiators in secret taught prisoners a few defensive moves or slipped them a sharper weapon. These small acts of kindness rarely changed the outcome, but they spoke of a shared understanding that both gladiators and prisoners were trapped in the same brutal system. The story of Lucius, a scribe who documented the games, offers a powerful perspective. He kept detailed records of every match, noting the names of prisoners, their crimes, and the method of their deaths. Over time, Lucius began to question the purpose of his work. He realized that the games were not about justice, but about reinforcing the power of the few over the many. Lucius secretly began to write the stories of the prisoners. The naval battles, Naumachia, a rigged show, the Colosseum, famous for its gladiator battles and animal hunts, was also home to one of the most spectacular yet cruelly orchestrated forms of entertainment in ancient Rome, the naval battles. Known as Naumachia, to the roaring crowds, these mock-sea battles were thrilling displays of Roman ingenuity and power. But beneath the surface, these spectacles were as unfair and rigged as the blood sports that filled the rest of the Colosseum schedule. The Roman emperors used Naumachia as grand performances to celebrate military victories, to honor their own rule, or to distract the masses during times of political unrest. Yet, despite the grandeur, the reality was that these staged sea battles were deeply manipulated. The Colosseum, though most famous as a land arena, could be specially flooded for these naval performances. Ingenious Roman engineering made it possible to channel water into the arena, creating a temporary lake. Wooden ships were assembled, and prisoners were forced to act as the crews. These prisoners often condemned criminals. Political dissidents and enslaved people were not trained sailors or warriors. They were thrust into the recreated war zones with little or no instruction. Their opponents were either better equipped prisoners or, in some cases, trained soldiers who were ordered to ensure the spectacle ended with maximum violence. One such battle was commissioned by Emperor Claudius to commemorate the conquest of Britannia. Thousands of prisoners were herded into makeshift ships, outfitted with minimal weaponry, and pushed into the arena's murky waters. Their opponents, who had been given better ships and sharp weapons, quickly overwhelmed them. Historical accounts describe these battles as incredible displays of Roman might, but they failed to capture the terror and helplessness of those forced to participate. Survivors were rare, as the victors were often ordered to execute all who surrendered. Take the story of Flaccus, a prisoner sentenced to fight in Naumachia. He was a farmer accused of stealing grain during a famine. Flaccus had never set foot on a ship before, yet on the day of the battle, he was chained to an oar and thrust into the mock naval war. His shipmates were a mix of thieves, rebels, and political prisoners. None of them knew how to maneuver a ship, let alone survive in battle. The opposing fleet was manned by condemned soldiers, promised their freedom if they won quickly and spectacularly. The battle was a massacre. Flaccus watched as flaming arrows tore through the sails. As soldiers leapt onto a ship, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Flaccus tried to surrender, but there was no mercy. His last memory was the roar of the crowd and the crackling of burning wood. The Roman people cheered for these battles, but few understood how rigged they were. Prisoners were frequently sent into battle without proper weapons, without knowledge of naval tactics, and without hope of survival. The logistics of these naval shows were immense. Water channels connected the Colosseum to nearby aqueducts, and it would take hours to fill the arena. Hundreds of slaves worked tirelessly to prepare the ships and stage the battle, all for a show that could last mere minutes. Behind the scenes, Roman officials manipulated every aspect of the event. They selected prisoners who would offer no real resistance, ensuring a swift and bloody conclusion that satisfied the bloodthirsty audience. Consider the story of Lucilla, a slave who worked in the Colosseum's lower chambers. She helped prepare the wooden ships, knowing they would soon be soaked in blood. Lucilla's brother Gaius was among the prisoners chosen for a in desperation. Lucilla tried to intervene. She sabotaged one of the enemy ships by loosening the nails that held its rudder in place. On the day of the battle, the enemy ship struggled to steer, giving Lucilla's brother and his crew a fleeting chance to fight back. They fought valiantly, but the imbalance was too great. Gaius was killed, but not before taking down 2 enemy soldiers, a small, almost invisible act of resistance in the grand theater of death. Lucilla continued to work in the Colosseum, quietly recording the names and stories of the condemned, ensuring they would not be forgotten. The Naumachia were not only cruel to the prisoners, they were also costly and dangerous to those who staged them. The flooding of the arena weakened the structure over time, and maintenance became a challenge. Some emperors like Domitian eventually abandoned these spectacles in favor of safer, more controllable shows. Yet the legacy of the Naumachia persisted. Emperor Augustus staged a naval battle on a specially constructed artificial lake, forcing 3,000 men to fight to the death. These events were marketed as reenactments of famous battles, but in reality, they were brutal executions disguised as entertainment. The prisoners who participated had no training, no survival skills, and no choice. They were condemned to die in the name of spectacle. There were even cases where animals were thrown into the water to add excitement. Crocodiles, hippos, and other exotic creatures, barely able to survive in the confined, shallow waters, were hunted for the amusement of the audience. The audience cheered for these grotesque scenes. Blind to the cruelty and deception that underpinned them, Roman historians recorded the grand scale of these events but often omitted the human suffering. It is through the stories of people like Lucilla, Flaccus, and the unnamed thousands that we glimpse the dark reality behind the rigged show. The Naumachia were not battles. They were executions performed under the illusion of combat. Even the gladiators, hardened by years of fighting, viewed the naval battles with a particular kind of dread. Some gladiators preferred to fight on dry land, knowing that in water their skills offered little protection. Drowning became a common fate, and the chaos of the staged naval battles left little room for strategy or heroism. Occasionally, stories emerged of prisoners banding together to mount a desperate resistance. There were whispered tales of makeshift alliances of crews who scuttled their own ships to deny the audience their expected spectacle. But such acts were rare and swiftly punished. The naval battles served a singular purpose: to glorify the emperor and to entertain the masses, regardless of the human cost. Today, the Colosseum stands as a silent witness to these rigged shows. The arena no longer floods, the wooden ships are long gone, but the ghosts of the condemned linger in its stones. If you walk among the ancient ruins, some say you can still hear the role of women in the arena when we picture the brutal spectacles of the Roman Colosseum. The image that often comes to mind is that of male gladiators fighting for their lives. However, history holds a lesser-known yet equally harrowing truth. Women, too, were forced into the arena. Their matches, like many others in the Colosseum, were often rigged and designed to entertain at the expense of their dignity and lives. The presence of female gladiators, known as gladiatresses, was rare, but not unheard of. They were treated as curiosities, as exotic novelties meant to shock and amuse the crowd. Unlike their male counterparts, these women were not given the chance to train extensively. Many were enslaved women, criminals, or captured enemies forced. into the games with minimal preparation. The Roman crowd viewed women in the arena as both scandalous and thrilling. They relished the sight of women clashing with each other or with wild animals, but these matches were seldom fair. The women were often under-equipped, under-trained, and strategically paired against stronger, more experienced fighters. One of the most tragic stories is that of Valeria, a noble woman who fell from grace after her family was accused of treason. She was stripped of her wealth and forced into the arena as a form of public humiliation. Her opponent was a trained female gladiator named Cressa, who had survived several matches and was known for her lethal skill. Valeria, given only a small dagger, was pushed into the arena wearing minimal armor. The crowd chanted for her death. Cressa, though skilled, hesitated. She saw that Valeria was no threat, just a victim. But Cressa also knew that mercy was not allowed. The crowd and the emperor demanded blood. In the end, Valeria was killed in a swift and brutal display. The crowd roared, satisfied by the spectacle. Cressa, though victorious, felt no pride. She would later confide to a scribe that she had lost more than just another opponent that day. She had lost her soul. Female gladiators also fought wild animals, often in deliberately unfair matches. Some were sent to the arena without weapons to face lions or leopards. Others were pitted against animals that had been weakened to create the illusion of a fair fight but were still capable of mauling them. Consider the story of Livia, a young woman sentenced to the games after being accused of theft. On the day of her match, she was told she would fight a bear. She was given a wooden spear with a blunted tip. The bear had been drugged to slow its movements, but it was still deadly. Livia fought bravely, using every ounce of her strength to survive. The crowd was enthralled, cheering at every near miss. But the outcome was never in doubt. The bear eventually overpowered her. Her death was recorded as an entertaining performance. These spectacles were not limited to women from the lower classes. Some emperors staged matches featuring women of noble birth, using the games as a tool for political punishment and public humiliation. The idea that a noble woman could be reduced to a gladiatrix thrilled the masses and served as a warning to the elite. The logistics behind these matches were carefully arranged to maximize the humiliation of the women involved. They were often forced to wear revealing or inappropriate clothing designed to entertain the male spectators. The violence was not just physical but deeply psychological. Behind the scenes, there were those who saw the injustice. Aurelia, a medic, who worked in the gladiatorial schools, witnessed the physical and emotional toll on female fighters. She treated their wounds, listened to their stories, and documented their suffering. Aurelia secretly trained some of the women, teaching them defensive techniques that might prolong their lives in the arena. Her quiet rebellion was an attempt to balance the scales, if only slightly. She helped women like Octavia, who survived her first match thanks to Aurelia's teachings. Octavia's survival became a rare story of triumph. She was later freed and chose to remain in Rome, dedicating her life to teaching other women how to defend themselves. Both in and out of the arena. Female gladiators, though rare, challenged the social norms of the time. Some Romans were fascinated by their presence, while others viewed them as an affront to tradition. The philosopher Juvenal famously mocked the idea of women taking up arms, reflecting the discomfort many Romans felt. Despite their challenges, some female gladiators earned respect among their peers. Their matches were dangerous, but they fought with determination, even knowing the odds were stacked against them. The Colosseum's treatment of women extended beyond the fighters. Women were often thrown into the arena as part of executions. Some were tied to stakes and left to face wild animals, a cruel punishment designed to terrorize and amuse. One of the most infamous punishments was the damnatio ad bestias, where condemned women were left defenseless as beasts were released upon them. These executions were especially popular during certain festivals, where the suffering of the condemned was woven into the day's entertainment. But even in these dark moments, acts of defiance emerged. Claudia, a woman sentenced to death by beasts, chose not to run when the gate was opened and the lion approached. Instead, she stood tall, locking eyes with the beast. The lion, perhaps confused by her lack of fear, hesitated. The guards released more animals, but Claudia remained unmoved until she was ultimately killed. Her story spread through the streets of Rome, whispered by those who admired her courage. Claudia became a symbol of defiance against an empire that thrived on the suffering of the powerless. there were others like her, women who faced impossible odds and chose to stand their ground. Their stories, though often buried under layers of Roman propaganda, survive in fragments in the writings of scribes, in the etched graffiti on ancient walls, and in the memories passed down through generations. The role of women in the arena was a carefully crafted illusion of empowerment. They were displayed as fierce warriors, but the games were always rigged to ensure their defeat, their humiliation, or their death. The Roman Colosseum, a place of grandeur and terror, used these women as pawns in its brutal theater. And yet, some managed to carve out moments of resistance, of courage, and of fleeting victory. Today, as we walk through the ruins of the Colosseum, we must remember not just the famous gladiators and emperors, but also the women whose stories have been largely forgotten. They too fought battles not for glory, but for survival, for dignity, and for the chance to be more than just entertainment. The execution games, death a spectacle of all the spectacles in the Roman Colosseum, none were as unapologetically brutal and theatrical as the execution games. Known to the Romans as damnatio et bestias or simply public executions, these events were designed to demonstrate Rome's unrelenting power over criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, and anyone the empire deemed expendable. Unlike gladiatorial battles or even the rigged animal hunts, execution games had a singular, undeniable purpose: to kill, and not just to kill, but to kill in a way that entertained. The condemned were often forced into the arena unarmed, dressed in mockery of their crimes, or chained together for added humiliation. Their deaths were staged with dramatic flair, meant to evoke both horror and satisfaction from the crowd. One of the most infamous execution spectacles was the reenactment of mythological stories. Prisoners would be forced to act out a legend, except their roles were not symbolic. They truly suffered the fate described in the myths. Take the story of Diodorus, a man accused of treason. He was selected to portray Prometheus, the Titan, who, in legend, was punished for giving fire to humanity by having his liver eaten daily by an eagle. For Diodorus, there was no symbolism. He was chained to a rock in the center of the arena, and a trained vulture was released to tear at his flesh. The scene was choreographed to mirror the ancient myth, but unlike Prometheus, Diodorus did not survive to see another day. The crowd cheered as the vulture feasted, not on the idea of punishment, but on Diodorus himself. Other myths were reenacted in equally grotesque fashion. The story of Orpheus, torn apart by wild animals, was a favorite. Prisoners playing Orpheus were left defenseless as leopards and lions were unleashed upon them. The execution games also included battles against impossible odds. Groups of condemned men were pitted against each other or against wild animals, with no real chance of survival. The weapons they were given were deliberately flawed shields with rotting leather, swords with broken tips, or spears with loose handles. One such man was Lucanus, a former soldier who had been imprisoned for desertion. His punishment was to face a group of hungry hyenas armed only with a blunt wooden staff. Lucanus fought valiantly, but the animals quickly overpowered him. His final moments, like those of many others, were treated as entertainment. Children attended these games. Families made day-long excursions of them. Food vendors walked the aisles selling snacks as the condemned were torn apart. For the Roman people, it was not just acceptable, it was expected. Some prisoners attempted to escape their fate in any way they could. There are recorded stories of men who charged at the beasts, hoping for a quick death, and others who defiantly took their own lives before the games began. One such prisoner, Selene, refused to play her assigned role in a mythological reenactment. She was to represent Andromeda, chained to a rock, waiting to be devoured by a sea monster. Selene chose to leap from the platform and break her neck rather than face the staged death prepared for her. The Roman authorities quickly covered the incident, replacing Selene with another prisoner to continue the performance uninterrupted. In some of the most elaborate executions, entire sets were built within the Colosseum. Wooden forests, artificial hills, and miniature rivers transformed the arena into a temporary world designed to stage the deaths of those Rome wished to erase, the cruelty did not stop with adults. Occasionally, children of condemned prisoners were also forced into the arena. Some were left alone with wild animals, others were made to witness their parents' deaths before meeting their own fate. One of the most chilling aspects of the execution games was their scheduling. They were often presented as interludes between gladiator fights, considered the least important but the most viscerally satisfying parts of the day. Spectators would eat, laugh, and gamble as people died before them. The crowd's distance from the condemned dehumanized the process. They did not see criminals or traitors. They saw entertainment. They saw a show. There were rare exceptions where the crowd demanded mercy. In some cases, a prisoner who displayed extraordinary courage or skill in the arena was granted a reprieve, but these moments were carefully controlled by the presiding editor of the games. Mercy was a spectacle to another way to thrill the audience. The execution games were not without critics. Philosophers like Seneca and historians like Tacitus occasionally condemned the cruelty of the spectacles, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming public appetite for blood. Some Roman poets, writing in the margins of history, questioned whether the pursuit of such entertainment was eroding the moral fabric of the empire. They saw the games as a dangerous addiction, numbing the population to violence and teaching them to delight in suffering. There are tales of secret societies within Rome who sought to save prisoners from the arena. These groups bribed guards, smuggled out condemned men, and quietly replaced them with the bodies of the already dead. Though their impact was limited, they stand as a testament to the fact that not all Romans were blind to the horrors of the Colosseum. One such tale is that of Cassius, a former gladiator who, after earning his freedom, used his knowledge of the arena to rescue prisoners sentenced to execution. Cassius and his allies succeeded in saving dozens before they were eventually captured and themselves condemned to the games they once fought to undermine. Their final stand in the arena, fighting against overwhelming odds, became a whispered legend among the slaves and prisoners of Rome. The execution games served as a grim reminder to the people of Rome: step out of line, challenge the empire, and you would become entertainment. But even in these darkest chapters, stories of resistance, defiance, and unexpected compassion emerged. Today, the ruins of the Colosseum stand as a monument not just to Roman engineering, but to the brutal excesses of an empire that mastered the art of turning death into spectacle. As we walk those ancient corridors, we should remember not only the grandeur of Rome, but the countless unnamed who perished for the amusement of the crowd. Their stories, though nearly erased, still echo in the stone. The gladiator schools, factories of fighters long before the roar of the Colosseum crowds and the clash of blades in the arena. The journey of a gladiator began in the brutal halls of the gladiator schools, known as Ludi Gladiatori. Far from the romanticized image of heroic warriors, these schools were grim factories of death, designed to mold men and sometimes women into living entertainment. The largest and most notorious of these schools was the Ludus Magnus, located just east of the Colosseum. It was not a place of honor or freedom, it was a prison, a training camp, and a relentless machine that stripped individuals of their identities and rebuilt them as tools for the games. Upon arrival, new recruits, often slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, were given new names. Their past lives were erased, and they became property of the Lanista, the gladiator school owner. The Lanista held complete power over their fates. Training began immediately and was vicious. Gladiators were subjected to brutal physical conditioning designed to harden their bodies for the arena. Days were spent sparring, carrying heavy weights, and practicing with wooden swords that were often heavier than real weapons to build muscle and endurance. The trainers or doctors were usually former gladiators themselves. Some showed grudging respect to their trainees. Others treated them with ruthless indifference. One such Lanista was Gaius Festus, a man known for orchestrating fixed matches and pitting his trainees in deadly scenarios long before they stepped into the Colosseum. Gaius believed in breaking a man's spirit early. He arranged mock battles where trainees were ordered to lose, to teach them submission and obedience. Among his trainees was Marcus, a former soldier captured during a border skirmish. Unlike most recruits, Marcus resisted Gaius's methods. He refused to throw fights during training. His defiance earned him brutal punishment, starvation, beatings, and isolation. But Marcus endured, Gladiator schools were not just about physical preparation, they were centers of psychological manipulation. Trainees were taught to crave the approval of the crowd, to see the possibility of freedom as a golden carrot dangling just out of reach. The idea that a gladiator could earn his freedom with enough victories was often a lie. Lannister rarely released their best fighters. A popular gladiator was too profitable to let go. Freedom was dangled as a dream to keep them compliant. Some gladiators, like Marcus, saw through this deception. He began secretly organizing small acts of rebellion within the Ludus Magnus. He encouraged other fighters to resist rigged matches, to fight for survival rather than for the Lannister's profit. The school's punishments were severe. Gladiators who disobeyed or underperformed were confined to tiny, windowless cells, often with little food or water. They were forced to train with defective weapons or sent into the arena prematurely, almost guaranteeing their deaths. Even the so-called elite gladiators who achieved fame were still prisoners. They were paraded in public processions, their victories exploited by politicians and emperors looking to curry favor with the masses. Gladiators were ranked in a rigid hierarchy, from the lowly novicious new recruits to the celebrated Retiarius and Murmillo, each trained with specialized weapons and fighting styles. Rivalries were stoked deliberately within the schools to keep the fighters focused on their personal glory, distracting them from the oppressive system that enslaved them. But beneath the rivalries, bonds often formed. Gladiators lived together, trained together, and bled together. They developed deep friendships and sometimes refused to kill each other in the arena, despite the crowd's bloodlust. One of the most famous stories is that of Quintus and Felix, two gladiators from rival schools who became close friends. They were eventually forced to face each other in the Colosseum. The crowd demanded a fight to the death, but Quintus and Felix chose to stage a prolonged, spectacular battle without delivering a fatal blow. The crowd, entertained by their skill and unaware of the deception, ultimately granted them both mercy. They lived to fight another day, but they also lived in constant fear of being separated and forced into truly unfair matches in the future. The politics within the schools were as brutal as the training. Lannister often accepted bribes from wealthy citizens to influence match outcomes. A nobleman could pay for his favorite gladiator to be spared or for his rival's champion to be quietly assigned a fatal opponent. Fights were fixed. Weapons were sometimes tampered with, and fighters were deliberately mismatched to ensure crowd satisfaction. Behind the scenes, some gladiators participated in secret gambling rings. They bet on their own matches, knowing when a fight was rigged, and when an opponent had been paid to lose. For those willing to take the risk, it was a dangerous but potentially lucrative game. Despite the crushing oppression, stories of rebellion emerged from the gladiator schools. Most famously, the revolt led by Spartacus the Gladiator who, alongside dozens of his fellow fighters, escaped from the ludus of Capua and sparked one of the largest slave uprisings in Roman history. Spartacus's rebellion terrified Rome. For years, he and his growing army of escaped slaves and gladiators roamed the Italian countryside, defeating Roman legions and threatening the very heart of the empire. The revolt was eventually crushed, but Spartacus's legacy haunted Rome for generations. His story became a symbol of resistance against the cruel machinery of the games. Within the walls of the gladiator schools, whispers of Spartacus endured. Some gladiators clung to the hope that they too might one day break free. Not all trainers were heartless. There were doctors who secretly trained their students to defend themselves against unfair odds. They taught techniques for disarming an opponent or exploiting the arena's terrain. For a few, this knowledge meant the difference between life and death. The Lannister ran their schools as businesses, and like any business, profit was the goal. The human cost of the lives of the gladiators was secondary. Corruption behind the games, the Roman Colosseum is often remembered as a grand amphitheater where men fought for glory and freedom. But behind the curtain of sand and steel, the games were riddled with corruption, bribery, and manipulation. What appeared to be fair contests were frequently orchestrated affairs, their outcomes bought and sold long before the first sword was drawn. Corruption infiltrated every level of the games, from the lowliest Lannister in the gladiator schools to the most powerful senators and emperors. The deeper one looks into the Colosseum's history, the more evident it becomes that few battles were left to chance. The most obvious form of corruption came in the selection of combatants. Wealthy citizens would pay vast sums to have their favorite gladiators face weaker opponents. A nobleman might bribe a lanista to ensure his champion fought an inexperienced prisoner, guaranteeing an easy victory. Conversely, rivals could pay to have a popular gladiator forced into an unwinnable match, effectively arranging their death in front of thousands the crowd seldom knew. The spectacle was what mattered. One of the most notorious brokers of such arrangements was Lucius Varro, a powerful games organizer during the reign of Emperor Commodus. Varro controlled the assignments of fighters and the order of matches. His reputation for rigging contests made him wealthy, but it also made him dangerous. Through careful manipulation, he could destroy the careers of gladiators and the reputations of their patrons. Lucius's network extended deep into the gladiator schools where trainers were paid to overwork certain fighters or sabotage their equipment. There are accounts of shields that were weakened, swords that were dulled, and helmets that were secretly cracked to ensure a favored opponent's victory. One gladiator, Cassianus, learned of such tampering just hours before his fight. His friend, a smith working in the school, discovered that Cassianus's sword had been improperly balanced on purpose. Cassianus fought anyway, using the flawed weapon, and through sheer skill and desperation, won the match. But his victory embarrassed the men who had paid for his defeat. Cassianus was later found dead in his cell. The official cause was an accident, but the fighters in his school knew better. Justice in the gladiator world was not about fairness. It was about who controlled the coin. Money did not just influence who fought, it influenced who lived and who died. Gladiators who gained immense popularity could sway the crowd, and sometimes the decision of the editor of the games. But for the right price, an editor's thumb could be turned down, even if the crowd demanded mercy. The famous gladiator Secundus was beloved by the people. After a brutal fight, he was left bleeding and vulnerable. The crowd roared for mercy, waving their handkerchiefs in the air. But the editor of the games, who had been bribed by Secundus's political enemies, gave the fatal signal. The crowd's fury was immense, but it was too late. Secundus was killed on the sand. His death became a scandal that rippled through Rome, but the system remained unchanged. Perhaps had spoken louder than public will. The corruption extended to the very highest echelons of power. Emperors often used the games as political tools. When an emperor's popularity waned, he would schedule grand games, offering free bread and thrilling battles to the masses. But behind these grand spectacles was often a mountain of debt paid for by squeezing provinces or accepting bribes. From the wealthy to fix matches in their favor, Emperor Commodus himself was known to rig his own appearances in the arena. He would fight weakened animals or poorly armed opponents to showcase his prowess, but the contests were staged. He sometimes executed gladiators who were ordered not to harm him. His victories were illusions, but the crowd was expected to cheer. Regardless, .comodus single quotes s vanity was legendary. He demanded to be known as Hercules Reborn and insisted on fighting in the arena despite the protests of his advisors. His rigged victories were spectacles of corruption that eventually contributed to his downfall. Beyond the Colosseum, the betting culture surrounding the games was another fertile ground for corruption. Bookmakers placed odds on each fight, and gambling debts often led to secret deals and betrayals. Some gladiators were bribed to throw matches to sway the betting markets. There are records of entire gladiator stables intentionally losing to manipulate odds and profit from massive wagers. But this was a dangerous game. Gladiators caught taking bribes could be executed publicly, not as punishment for dishonesty, but to protect the illusion of fairness. The corruption reached into the supply chains as well. Wild animals used in the Naumachia arena were frequently obtained through illegal trades and smuggling networks. Middlemen sold sick or drugged animals to organizers at inflated prices. Sometimes animals were deliberately weakened before being sent into the arena to make the fights more predictable. Corruption also tainted the training schools. Some lannistae would bribe officials to secure prisoners with particular fighting skills or physical advantages. Others would sell unfit or disobedient slaves to rival schools, only to have them return later as victims in fixed matches. One lanista, Decimus Antonius, ran a covert trade where he would sabotage his own fighters' chances in exchange for political favors. He orchestrated matches where his less profitable gladiators would conveniently die, ensuring that his most popular fighters continued to win and draw crowds. The tangled web of corruption even touched the medical staff. Arena medics, tasked with tending to wounded fighters, were sometimes bribed to provide false reports, either to claim a fighter was too injured to continue or to minimize the severity of an injury, so a fighter could be forced back into combat. There are stories of gladiators who were declared healed, only to collapse moments after re-entering the arena, their bodies too broken to endure another fight. Even death was not always the end. Families of deceased gladiators would sometimes bribe officials to falsify death records so the fighter could be smuggled away and live in hiding. Some gladiators faked their deaths to escape the brutal cycle, only to live out their days under new identities far from Rome. Corruption in the Colosseum was so pervasive that some historians argue it became an accepted part of the games, a hidden rulebook understood by all participants. Yet amidst this corruption, moments of genuine defiance still emerged. Fighters who refused to throw matches, crowds who rioted when a favorite gladiator was unjustly killed, and even occasional editors who resisted bribery all left their marks on the blood-stained history of the games. The Roman Colosseum was never just a place of combat, it was a stage for human ambition, greed, and the endless dance between power and survival. While the grandeur of the arena has captivated imaginations for centuries, its underbelly of corruption tells a far more complex story, a story where justice could be bought, where heroes could be doomed by coin, and where even the mightiest could fall victim to the invisible hand that controlled the games. Gladiator fan culture, the obsession of Rome. The Roman Colosseum was not merely an arena for violence, it was the epicenter of a cultural phenomenon. Gladiators were not just fighters. They were celebrities, icons, and objects of mass obsession. Across the empire, the adulation of gladiators became a powerful, and at times bizarre, aspect of Roman society. Fan culture in ancient Rome was intense, deeply personal, and sometimes dangerously unbalanced. Gladiators were idolized in ways that transcended their bloody profession. They appeared on pottery, graffiti, and even children's toys. Their images adorned oil lamps, mosaics, and public murals. Vendors sold small statues, medallions, and amulets bearing their likenesses. Gladiators became the first action figures of their age. The most famous gladiators developed loyal fan bases, each with their own chants, colors, and slogans. Supporters would gather outside the ludi, the gladiator schools, cheering their favorites as they marched to the arena. The chants of habit, he has it, and Eucla, kill him, were common refrains among frenzied supporters. Some gladiators even had what we might now call groupies. Ancient graffiti discovered in Pompeii reveals love notes and public declarations of affection. One inscription reads, "Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh." Another, scrawled in a back alley, proclaims, "Crescens the net fighter, the heartthrob of girls." These warriors, often slaves with no control over their destinies, found themselves elevated to a strange social status. Despite their lowly origins, their fame allowed them to attract admirers from all social classes. Even the Roman elite. The allure of the gladiator was a blend of danger and desirability. They were the embodiment of raw power, survival against odds, and masculine beauty marked by battle scars. Many Roman women, especially those from upper-class families, were captivated by gladiators. There were whispered tales of noble women slipping into the gladiator barracks at night, or bribing Lannister to arrange secret meetings. One famous scandal involved Epia, a senator's wife who abandoned her comfortable life to run away with a gladiator named Sergius. She was mocked in public poems and vilified by historians, but her story reveals the irresistible pull gladiators held over the Roman imagination. The phenomenon went beyond personal attraction. Gladiators became brands. The most skilled fighters were often sponsored by powerful patrons. Their names were chanted in markets and inscribed on tavern walls. Even children played games where they pretended to be their favorite gladiators, mimicking their fighting styles and shouting their battle cries. The gambling culture surrounding the games fueled the fanaticism. Fans didn't just watch, they bet heavily on their champions. Wagers could range from small coins to entire estates. The stakes were high, and so were the emotions. Rivalries between fan groups often turned violent. Street brawls erupted over disputed matches or insults hurled at opposing gladiators. Some factions aligned themselves with specific Lannister or gladiator schools, creating a proto-sporting club environment where loyalty was fierce and grudges could last for years. The fanbase also had a political voice. Gladiators could become tools of influence. Emperors, desperate for public favor, sometimes sponsored lavish games featuring popular fighters to boost their approval ratings. The crowd's reaction to a gladiator's performance could make or break an emperor's popularity. When the famous gladiator Flamma was granted mercy by the editor of the games, the crowd erupted in approval. Flamma's reputation soared, and his continued survival became a recurring demand from the people. Stories suggest that emperors, mindful of public opinion, occasionally intervened to spare the lives of fan favorites. The connection between the queen, to spare the lives of fan favorites. The connection between the crowd and the gladiator was deeply emotional. Fans celebrated victories with street parties and mourned deaths with crude memorials scrawled on city walls. Some fans wore pendants shaped like the weapons of their favorite fighters, while others carved their names into benches in the Colosseum. There were even superstitions attached to gladiators. Some believed that a drop of a gladiator's blood could bring fertility, or that his sweat held medicinal properties. Vendors sold vials of what they claimed was gladiator sweat, scraped from the fighters after their matches. These bizarre souvenirs were highly sought after by Roman women. The gladiators themselves were both participants and prisoners in this obsession. They benefited from the fame, receiving better food, gifts from admirers, and sometimes leniency in the arena. But fame was a double-edged sword. Popular fighters were often placed in more dangerous, high-profile matches to satisfy the crowd's thirst for excitement. Some gladiators actively cultivated their fanbase, learning to play to the crowd to milk dramatic moments, to fight not just to win, but to entertain. They would taunt opponents, perform risky maneuvers, and gesture to the spectators to build tension. One such performer was Verus, a celebrated gladiator known for his theatrical flair. He famously staged mock defeats to whip the crowd into a frenzy, only to mount miraculous comebacks that drove his supporters wild. His showmanship earned him the adoration of thousands, but it also made him a prime target for bribery and manipulation. When a rival Lanista attempted to bribe Verus to throw a critical fight, the gladiator faced a dangerous choice. He ultimately defied the bribery, winning the match in spectacular fashion and solidifying his legend. But his refusal made him enemies. The fan obsession also extended beyond the living. When a popular gladiator died, his funeral could draw massive crowds. Fans would gather to pay respects, some weeping openly, others singing chants in his honor. Makeshift shrines would appear overnight, covered in flowers, offerings, and written tributes. The death of the gladiator Hermes triggered days of public mourning in his district. His former supporters organized games in his memory, staging fights where the proceeds funded a grand memorial statue. The obsession with gladiators left a mark on Roman literature and satire. Poets both praised and mocked the culture of celebrity. Juvenal, the Roman satirist, lamented how women preferred the company of scarred gladiators over the polished the end of the games, a slow collapse, the blood, the cheers, the roar of the crowds all seemed eternal. The gladiatorial games, once the beating heart of Roman entertainment, slowly began to fade, not with a dramatic final battle, but with a quiet, crumbling retreat from the public eye. The end of the games was not a sudden fall, but a slow, painful collapse. For centuries, the Colosseum had been the center of Roman life. It was where emperors secured loyalty, where the poor found distraction, and where gladiators lived and died for the amusement of others. But no empire lasts forever, and the games were no exception. The seeds of decline were sown as early as the 3rd century CE Rome. Once the unconquerable giant began to stagger under the weight of its vast territories, economic instability, and constant wars. Maintaining the empire drained the treasury, and the costly games were increasingly seen as an unsustainable luxury. The supply chains that once brought exotic animals from Africa and the Middle East began to fail. Entire species were hunted to near extinction to satisfy Roman bloodlust. When the beasts became scarce, the grand hunts lost their appeal. The collapse of Rome's trade networks also made it harder to import slaves and prisoners of war, the lifeblood of the gladiatorial games. With fewer new fighters, Lanistae struggled to maintain their stables. Gladiator schools closed one by one as recruitment dwindled. At the same time, The rise of Christianity began to challenge the cultural foundation of the games. The new faith emphasized mercy, compassion, and the sanctity of life values in direct opposition to the brutal spectacles of the arena. Christian leaders denounced the games as barbaric. Bishops and priests preached against the bloodshed, urging the faithful to abandon the Colosseum and its rituals of death. As Christianity spread, so did public discomfort with the games. One of the pivotal moments in the decline came during the reign of Emperor Constantine the Great. While Constantine did not immediately ban the games, he drastically reduced state sponsorship and redirected imperial funds toward Christian causes. The emperor's personal conversion to Christianity sent a powerful message. Rome was changing. Crowds that once filled the Colosseum began to thin. Gladiators who had once been gods among men now found fewer eager eyes watching their battles. The roar of the people was slowly replaced by silence, yet the games did not vanish overnight. They lingered, especially in the outlying provinces where tradition clung stubbornly to life. Some local rulers continued to stage matches, hoping to hold on to the old ways. But the momentum had shifted. The story of the monk Naumachia illustrates this turning point. In the late 4th century CE, Naumachia traveled to Rome and, upon witnessing a gladiatorial match, the psychology of the spectators, why Rome cheered for blood, why did the people of Rome, from emperors to beggars, flock to the Colosseum to witness slaughter? What made the sight of blood, pain, and death not only acceptable but desirable? To understand the gladiatorial games, we must understand the minds of those who cheered. In the world of ancient Rome, violence was not hidden. It was part of everyday life. Executions were public, punishments were brutal, and wars were glorified. The Roman psyche was conditioned to see death not as a private sorrow but as a public spectacle. The games were simply the grandest expression of this cultural norm, but it was more than cultural conditioning. The Colosseum offered a release. Life in Rome, especially for the poor, was harsh. The daily struggle for food, work, and survival left people desperate for distraction. The games provided an outlet, a space where the frustrations of life could be poured into cheers, jeers, and cries for blood. The gladiators became vessels for these emotions. When the crowd screamed for death, they were often screaming at their own powerlessness, their own hardships, their own fleeting existence in a society that valued power above all else. Psychologically, the games allowed the Roman masses to experience catharsis, a cleansing of the soul through the extreme display of violence. Watching others suffer, struggle, and die gave the spectators a perverse sense of control over their own fears. Death was brought close, but in a controlled environment where the viewer was safe, the Colosseum was a theater of dominance. The spectators, seated in strict social hierarchies, could gaze down upon the arena and for a moment feel superior to those fighting for their lives below. Even the poorest Roman, sitting in the highest tier, was elevated above the gladiator, the animal, the criminal facing execution. The structure of the Colosseum itself reinforced this dynamic. The emperor had the best seat, the senators close by the equestrians' necks, the common citizens above them, and the slaves and women in the highest, most distant rows. Each spectator, regardless of class, was granted a sliver of power simply by watching. For many, the games were a way to project their own struggles onto the fighters below. A defeated gladiator might represent an oppressive tax collector, a cruel neighbor, or even fate itself. When the crowd called for mercy or death, they were often expressing their own desires, frustrations, and thirst for justice, however warped that justice might have been. The Roman appetite for blood was not without nuance. The crowd did not blindly call for death in every case. They admired bravery, skill, and honor. A gladiator who fought valiantly, even in defeat, could earn the crowd's favor and sometimes their mercy, but there was a darker side. The crowd could be cruel, capricious, and savage. They enjoyed seeing terror in a prisoner's eyes. They laughed when an inexperienced fighter stumbled. They roared when the execution of a criminal became particularly gruesome. Some games were specifically designed to indulge these brutal desires. The Venetians, the animal hunts, offered spectacles where exotic beasts were slaughtered for amusement. The more helpless the animal, the louder the cheers. The execution games, where condemned criminals were forced to reenact myths in which they were violently killed, were some of the most eagerly anticipated events. Why did the people not turn away? Why did they crave these sights Some historians believe that the games functioned as a pressure valve for society. By allowing the masses to indulge their violent impulses in a controlled setting, the state prevented those impulses from spilling into rebellion. The games unified the city not in peace, but in shared violence. The psychological bond between the emperor and the crowd was also central. When the emperor offered games, he was offering a gift of spectacle that distracted the people from famine, war, or political strife. In this exchange, the emperor earned loyalty, and the people felt acknowledged. The psychology of the crowd was complex. Spectators might cheer for the same gladiator one day and demand his death the next. The anonymity of the mob emboldened cruelty. Individual compassion could be drowned in the collective roar. Roman philosophers like Seneca were deeply troubled by this. Seneca wrote about the corrosive effect of the games on the soul, describing how even kind men became cruel when absorbed by the crowd's frenzy. He warned that repeated exposure to the violence of the arena would erode empathy and breed indifference to human suffering, yet the games continued century after century. They were too intoxicating, too deeply embedded in Roman identity to be easily dismantled. The psychology of the spectators was not merely bloodthirsty. It was shaped by Rome's core values: honor, strength, and public display. To the Roman mind, life was a constant battle. The arena simply made that battle visible. The fascination with the games also stemmed from the human attraction to risk and spectacle. The uncertainty of each match, the potential for a dramatic comeback or a shocking death, captivated the audience in the same way that modern people are drawn to dangerous sports or high-stakes competitions. But the Colosseum amplified these emotions to a lethal degree. The stakes were not trophies, they were lives. Over time, as Rome's culture shifted and Christianity gained prominence, many began to question the morality of these spectacles. But for generations, the games served a psychological need: to confront death without dying, to channel rage without rebellion, to watch from the safety of the stands as others faced the ultimate gamble. Even today, the echoes of that fascination remain. Our modern appetite for violent entertainment in films, sports, and video games can trace some of its roots back to the Colosseum. We may have traded swords for screens, but the psychological hunger endures. The Roman spectators came for blood, but they left with something more: a fleeting sense of power, a momentary escape, and a glimpse into the darkest corners of the human heart. The secret lives of gladiators when the sand settled, when the roar of the crowd faded, when the doors of the Colosseum clanged shut. The gladiators returned to a world that most of Rome never saw. Beneath the spectacle was a hidden life, one filled with brutal routines, forbidden relationships, personal ambitions, and fleeting hopes of freedom. The secret lives of gladiators were far more complex than the public imagined. To most spectators, gladiators were simply living weapons brought out to fight, to die, and to entertain. But outside the arena, they were men and sometimes women with stories that rarely survived the passage of time. Gladiators came from diverse backgrounds. Some were slaves captured from the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire. Others were criminals condemned to fight. A rare few were volunteers, free men who willingly joined the arena in search of fame, fortune, or the thrill of battle. Regardless of their origins, they all became property of the lanista, the owner and trainer of the gladiator school. Life in the ludus was harsh and disciplined. Gladiators lived in communal barracks, their daily routines tightly controlled. They trained relentlessly under the watchful eyes of veteran fighters known as doctors. These trainers pushed them to the edge of physical endurance, drilling them in weapon skills, footwork, and tactics specific to their combat class. Every gladiator was assigned a specific fighting style, each with its own weapons, armor, and strategy. The heavily armored secutor with a short sword and large shield, the nimble retiarius armed with a net and trident, the fearsome Murmillo with his distinctive helmet and gladius. Each style had strengths and weaknesses, carefully matched to create exciting and often uneven fights. But their training was not just about combat. Gladiators were taught to perform. They learned how to engage the crowd, how to play to the audience's emotions, and how to turn a fight into theater. A good show can mean mercy. A boring one could mean death. Within the walls of the gladiator schools, friendships formed, but so did bitter rivalries. Gladiators who lived, trained, and fought side by side often formed bonds stronger than brotherhood. They shared meals, mended each other's wounds, and offer comfort in a world where tomorrow could bring death. Yet, they also knew that one day they might be ordered to fight each other. Some gladiators formed secret alliances, agreeing to spare each other in the arena or to fight in a way that maximized drama without risking fatal blows. Others betrayed such pacts, driven by desperation, ambition, or the manipulations of the lanista. Their personal lives were filled with restrictions and dangers. Many were forbidden to marry, but love still found its way into the ludus. Some gladiators had affairs with local women, with slaves from nearby households, and even with noble women drawn to the forbidden allure of the fighter. One of the most famous scandals involved the gladiator Eros, whose affair with the wife of a powerful senator led to his forced match against overwhelming odds. His public execution became a symbol of both the dangers of crossing the social order and the intoxicating draw of the gladiators' world. Despite the hardship, gladiators were often better fed and better housed than Rome's poorest citizens. They received high-protein diets, massages, and medical attention. Injuries were common, but experienced medics traveled with the schools, doing their best to keep the fighters alive. Some gladiators thrived in this brutal world, achieving celebrity status. Victories brought gifts, coins, and privileges. Gladiators could be awarded the rudes, a wooden sword symbolizing their freedom. Those who earned the rudes often faced a painful choice: embrace their freedom and leave the blood-soaked fame behind, or continue fighting for wealth and glory. Some chose to keep fighting, unable to abandon the only life they had known. Others walked away, though freedom did not always mean peace. Former gladiators often struggled to find purpose beyond the arena. Their fame faded quickly, and many returned to lives of poverty or became trainers for the next generation. Within the schools, there were strict codes of conduct, but corruption was never far away. Bribes, secret deals, and behind the scenes wagers shaped many matches. Some fights were fixed. Some fighters were deliberately paired to guarantee a certain outcome, driven by the greed of the lanista or the demands of wealthy patrons. The pressure on gladiators was immense. Losing a fight could mean death, but even winning could make enemies. Victorious gladiators attracted the attention of jealous rivals, corrupt officials, and ambitious lanistae who saw them as valuable pawns. Some gladiators rose to legendary status. Flamma, the Syrian gladiator, famously refused his freedom multiple times, choosing instead to continue fighting. His legend grew not just because of his skill, but because he symbolized the gladiator's paradox, a man trapped by his fame and his thirst for the fight. The secret lives of gladiators were also filled with rituals and superstitions. Before each match, fighters performed sacred rites, offering prayers to Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, or to Fortuna, the goddess of luck. Some wore amulets, others carved protective symbols into their weapons. They knew that death could come at any moment, and they saw every edge, even from the gods. Not all gladiators met their end in the arena. Some died in training accidents, some from untreated infections, and some were murdered in the shadows of the ludus. Others survived long enough to train new recruits, passing on their skills and their stories. Despite the chains, the blood, and the cruelty, some gladiators found a sense of identity and pride in their profession. They were admired, feared, and at least for a time remembered. Their secret lives remind us that even within the harshest systems, humanity persists. Love, friendship, ambition, betrayal, and hope existed alongside violence and death. Behind every helmet was a person, behind every roar of the crowd was a story waiting to be told. The world saw gladiators as instruments of entertainment, but in the quiet moments away from the sand, the swords, and the spectators, they were simply men trying to survive a game they never chose to play. The business of blood, the economics of the games, behind the thunderous applause, the gleaming armor, and the dramatic deaths, there was something else that powered the gladiatorial games' money. The games were not just about entertainment. They were an immense, complex, and carefully orchestrated business. And like all businesses, they revolved around profit, power, and influence. The Colosseum itself was a financial giant, constructed under Emperor Vespasian and completed by his son Titus. It was the crown jewel of public works in Rome. Admission to most of the games was free, a gift from the emperor to the people, but the costs to stage these spectacles were astronomical dots, so who paid for the blood? Much of the financial burden fell on the emperor and wealthy Roman elites, especially magistrates seeking political favor. Sponsoring a grand set of games known as Munera was a strategic investment. In Rome, popularity equaled power. A lavish spectacle could win votes, silence critics, and curry favor with the mob. The cost of organizing a major event was staggering. Exotic animals had to be captured, transported, and housed. Gladiators needed to be purchased, trained, and maintained. Special effects, stage machinery, and even elaborate sets like forests and ships for mock naval battles required skilled labor and extensive resources. The empire's vast trade networks were crucial to sustaining this economy of spectacle. Lions came from North Africa, tigers from India, elephants from sub-Saharan Africa, and crocodiles from the Nile. Merchants, animal handlers, and transport crews all profited from this bloody supply chain. The capture and transport of wild animals became a booming industry in its own right. Expeditions were financed to capture thousands of animals for a single event. The more exotic the creature, the greater the prestige and the higher the cost. The gladiators themselves were investments. Some were purchased cheaply, particularly slaves or criminals. Others, especially skilled fighters or celebrities, commanded high prices. A top gladiator could be worth as much as an elite racehorse. Gladiator schools operated as businesses. The Lanista, owner of the school, profited by renting out his fighters to gain sponsors. The more victories a gladiator secured, the more valuable he became. Some Lanistae became incredibly wealthy, operating vast networks of fighters across the empire. Betting added another layer to the gladiatorial economy. Romans bet passionately on the games, from simple wagers among friends to vast sums staked by the elite. Gambling was a critical driver of interest. Bookmakers thrived, and secret deals were struck to influence fight outcomes. Corruption seeped into every corner. Bribing a lanista to ensure a particular result was not uncommon. Gladiators could be paid to throw matches. In some cases, wealthy patrons manipulated fights for financial gain or personal revenge. The seating arrangements in the Colosseum also had financial dimensions. While entrance to most games was free, the best seats were controlled by Rome's most powerful families and could be sold or exchanged as favors. Special boxes near the arena floor were signs of status and influence. Vendors lined the streets around the Colosseum, selling food, drinks, amulets, and gladiator-themed souvenirs. Clay figurines, oil lamps shaped like gladiators, and other memorabilia were popular among fans. Even in ancient Rome, spectacle merchandise was big business. The games also fueled local economies. When a major event was announced, people flooded into the city. Inns, taverns, food stalls, and craftsmen benefited enormously. Entire neighborhoods could experience economic booms based on a single week of games. The Roman emperors understood that their investment in the games was also an investment in social control. Lavish spectacles distracted the masses from the hardships of daily life. The concept of panem et circenses spread, and circuses became the foundation of Rome's social contract. By providing free grain and grand entertainment, emperors could maintain public order and loyalty. This political strategy, while expensive, proved incredibly effective. The masses, while often living in squalor, remained fiercely devoted to the emperors who entertained them. The costs of staging the games were justified not by direct profit, but by the power they preserved. For an ambitious politician, sponsoring games could mean the difference between election and obscurity. For an emperor, they were a safeguard against revolt. The sheer scale of some events is hard to imagine. During the inauguration of the Colosseum, Emperor Titus reportedly staged games that lasted for 100 consecutive days, involving thousands of animals and hundreds of gladiators. These spectacles consumed vast imperial resources but solidified Titus's popularity. Over time, as Rome's economy faltered and the empire stretched itself thin, the burden of funding the games became harder to sustain. Emperors like Constantine began to cut back on the spectacles, redirecting funds to other priorities, including the growing Christian church. Yet even as the state scaled down, the private economy around the games persisted. Gladiator trainers, animal merchants, bookmakers, and street vendors continued to profit until the very end. The business of blood also had a darker cost. The relentless demand for animals drove species toward extinction in some regions. Entire herds of elephants were decimated. North African lions, once abundant, became increasingly rare. Human lives, too, were exploited in this machinery of profit. Condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and slaves were bought and sold as disposable entertainment. The gladiatorial economy depended on the continuous supply of fresh bodies. Even as the games faded, their economic legacy endured. The template of turning mass entertainment into a profitable enterprise continued long after the last gladiatorial match. From medieval jousts to modern sports stadiums, echoes of the Roman model remain. The Colosseum, though now a ruin, was once the beating heart of a thriving commercial ecosystem. Beneath its crumbling arches, deals were made, fortunes were wagered, and lives were traded all in the name of spectacle. The games were not just a display of power or a cultural phenomenon. They were a carefully constructed economy where blood was currency, fame was a commodity, and death was business. And in Rome, as in much of human history, business always finds a way. The political power of the arena of the Colosseum was not just an amphitheater, it was a political machine. Every sea, every spectacle, every drop of blood served a purpose far greater than mere entertainment. The games were a language of power, spoken fluently by emperors and politicians who understood how to manipulate the crowd, control the narrative, and rule an empire. In Rome, where political fortunes could rise and fall overnight, public favor was everything. And the Colosseum was the stage upon which political legacies were built and destroyed. The emperors of Rome mastered this game. They wielded the games as weapons, using grand spectacles to win loyalty, silence dissent, and distract the population from economic hardship or political turmoil. When Rome was starving, when uprisings simmered, when scandal threatened, the answer was simple: give the people games, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. This was the formula. Feed the people, entertain them, and they will not rebel. The Colosseum became the beating heart of this strategy. The games were not optional for the rulers of Rome. They were essential acts of public diplomacy. An emperor who failed to provide spectacular games risked losing the affection of the masses. An emperor who excelled in generosity and grandeur could cement his place as a beloved leader. Take, for example, Emperor Augustus. His reign marked a golden age of calculated public image. He used the games to solidify his status as Rome's savior. By sponsoring elaborate spectacles and ensuring free grain distribution, Augustus became the embodiment of prosperity and peace, even as he ruled with firm authority. His successors learned this lesson well. Emperor Titus, during the inauguration of the Colosseum, staged games that lasted 100 consecutive days. It was a performance of imperial power, a public declaration that the Flavian dynasty cared for the people. The games included gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, naval battles, and mass executions. Through these spectacles, Titus etched his name into the collective memory of Rome, but it wasn't just the emperors. Local politicians, aspiring senators, and magistrates also leveraged the games to climb the political ladder. Sponsoring gladiatorial events was one of the fastest ways to gain public favor. The bigger the show, the greater the applause, and the stronger the political foothold. These ambitious men often sank their fortunes into games, sometimes driving themselves into debt, to impress the crowd. Success could mean election to higher office. Failure could mean ridicule or worse, political obscurity. The games also served as a unifying force. In a city as vast and diverse as Rome, with citizens, freedmen, slaves, and foreigners packed into its crowded streets, the Colosseum provided a shared experience. The games crossed class boundaries. The poor sat in the upper tiers, the wealthy in marble-clad boxes. But all eyes were fixed on the same blood-soaked sand. The arena gave the people a voice, albeit a dangerous one. When the crowd roared in approval or disapproval, the emperor listened. In some instances, public opinion expressed in the Colosseum could sway imperial decisions. Mercy gestures, known as missio, were often influenced by the crowd's demands. Emperors used this to their advantage, carefully curating the kinds of spectacles that would stir the most excitement. They ensured that criminals guilty of heinous crimes were prominently executed. They staged mythical reenactments that glorified Roman values. They presented exotic beasts to awe the crowd. Political propaganda was woven into every aspect of the games. Victories in the arena symbolized Rome's military dominance. The parade of captured animals and foreign warriors reminded spectators of Rome's global reach. Even the architecture of the Colosseum, adorned with imperial statues and triumphal arches, reinforced the emperor's supremacy. The games also served as a brutal warning. They demonstrated the consequences of defying Rome. Rebellious slaves, enemy soldiers, and condemned criminals were forced into the arena as a living lesson of Rome's justice. Their deaths were both punishment and spectacle. The Colosseum could absorb political tensions and redirect them into controlled violence. When famine struck or taxes soared, the games were quickly expanded. The people were given a distraction, a release for their frustrations. Some emperors manipulated the crowd with near genius. Emperor Trajan, for example, held a massive set of games following his conquest of Dacia. Over 11,000 animals and more than 10,000 gladiators participated. The message was clear: Rome was powerful, Rome was generous, and Trajan was the man who delivered both. But the political use of the games was not without risk. The same crowd that could be pacified with entertainment could also turn hostile. If the games were poorly organized, if the spectacles failed to impress, or if the emperor appeared stingy, the crowd could erupt in jeers, protests, or even riots. One of the most infamous examples occurred during the reign of Emperor Commodus. Unlike his predecessors, Commodus did not simply sponsor the games, he starred in them. He entered the arena dressed as Hercules and fought as a gladiator. Though the fights were staged for his victory, his actions scandalized the Senate and much of Rome's elite. Commodus believed he was winning the love of the people, but his obsession with the games ultimately eroded his authority. His erratic behavior, including killing animals in the arena with a bow while shielded from danger, made him a figure of ridicule and fear. His assassination in 192 CE was, in part, a reaction to his abuse of power and spectacle. The political power of the arena extended beyond Rome's borders. In the provinces, amphitheaters were constructed to project Roman culture and authority. Local leaders staged games to curry favor with the empire, and the Colosseum's influence rippled throughout the Mediterranean. Over centuries, the games became a cornerstone of Roman identity, woven into the empire's political fabric. But as the economy weakened and Christianity spread, the games lost their central role. Christian leaders condemned the violence, and emperors gradually reduced their scale, yet the legacy of the Colosseum's political power endured. It demonstrated that mass entertainment could unite, distract, and manipulate society. It showed that rulers who understood the crowd could maintain control even in times of crisis. The Colosseum was not just stone and sand. It was a theater of empire, a palace of influence, a tool of rulers who knew that to command Rome, one must command its attention. In Rome, politics and spectacle were forever intertwined. The blood that soaked the arena was not just for sport, it was for power. Chapter 15. Forgotten Gladiators. Stories lost to time. History remembers the names of a few gladiators. Spartacus, Flamma, and Commodus linger in the echoes of the Colosseum. But for every gladiator we remember, thousands more fought, bled, and died with their stories swallowed by time. The sands of the arena bear no inscriptions. They hold no headstones. The lives of countless gladiators vanished without record, without family to mourn them, and without songs to honor them. Who were these forgotten warriors? Some came from distant lands, deserts, forests, and mountains conquered by Rome's legions. Others were born on Roman soil but thrown into the arena as criminals or political scapegoats. Some were slaves who never saw freedom. Others were volunteers, men who believed the arena was their path to glory or fortune. Their names were shouted by the crowd, written briefly on game rosters, and then, when they fell, erased from memory. Archaeologists have unearthed fragments, graffiti scratched on stone walls, funerary inscriptions, and forgotten cemeteries, and battered helmets buried beneath the ruins of training schools. These silent witnesses tell us that behind every helmet, every sword, every staged victory, there was a person with dreams, fears, and loved ones. One such inscription, found outside the Colosseum, reads simply, "For Felix, who fought bravely, beloved by his comrades, nothing else remains." No lineage, no victories counted, no record of the moment his life ended. Some gladiators lived long enough to build small followings. Their faces appeared on oil lamps, their names chanted in the streets, but fame was fleeting. The next fight, the next hero, the next spectacle always came. What of the woman named Amazonia? Her name appears briefly in ancient graffiti, scrawled on a wall near Pompeii. Amazonia, the beautiful, who fought like a man and won. No other record survives. Was she a myth? A hero? Or a forgotten casualty? Consider the gladiator Gannicus. Unlike Spartacus, his name does not thunder through the halls of history. Yet fragments suggest he was once a crowd favorite, a daring fighter with a reckless style. Did he fall in an obscure battle? Did he die unwept? His memory outshined by more politically significant men? The Colosseum was not a place of lasting fame for most. It was a stage where men became briefly immortal until the next match. Life of a forgotten gladiator was filled with routine, fear, and fleeting hopes. They trained relentlessly, fought desperately, and often died anonymously. Some fought for a chance at freedom, clutching the slim hope of earning the rudes the wooden sword that granted their release. But even those who survived often vanished into poverty, obscurity, or new wars far from Rome's shining cities. The personal lives of these men and women remain shadows. Who did they love? Who mourned them? Perhaps there were lovers who wept quietly after the roar of the crowd faded. Perhaps there were children who never knew their fathers, or parents who died believing their sons were long lost. Some gladiators left faint traces in the form of modest gravestones, funded by fellow fighters who pooled their meager winnings to honor a fallen comrade. Others were likely buried in mass graves, stripped of their identity, their stories absorbed into the earth. The sands of the arena were indifferent. They cared nothing for bravery or fear, for hope or despair. They swallowed every step, every drop of blood, every name. There are records of peculiar gladiators who defied convention, a left-handed secutor, a dwarf gladiator who fought against wild animals, a blindfolded fighter who became a minor legend in provincial games. Yet even these strange figures quickly faded from history, their tales surviving only in the most obscure texts or fleeting mentions. The unfair matches of the Colosseum consumed not only animals and criminals but the identities of those forced to fight in spectacles they could not win. Imagine the gladiator who entered the arena against a caged tiger, knowing the animal had been starved and prodded to frenzy. Imagine the prisoner handed a wooden stick to face a trained champion. Their names were not preserved. Their stories were not celebrated. Yet their deaths thrilled the crowd. We remember Spartacus because he defied Rome. We remember Commodus because his madness shocked the empire. But we forget the thousands who fought simply because they had no choice. For every famous battle, there were countless smaller ones, staged in provincial amphitheaters far from the glory of Rome. These local games often lacked scribes, lacked historians, and lacked audiences who cared to remember. In North Africa, in Gaul, and the dusty arenas of Syria, gladiators fought and died in front of local crowds, their legacies never reaching the capital. For them, the fight was not a path to immortality. It was simply survival. Some gladiators may have wanted to be remembered. Others likely prayed to be forgotten, to vanish quietly from the cruel machinery of the games. The forgotten gladiators shaped the rhythm of the Colosseum just as much as the legends did. They filled the rosters, they bled for the cheers, and they made the spectacles possible. Their absence from our history books does not erase their existence. It only underscores the brutality of a system that consumed them so efficiently. Perhaps they never sought glory. Perhaps their last thoughts were not of the crowd, but of home, of faces they would never see again. Perhaps their stories linger, not in the grand monuments, but in the silent stones, the weathered graffiti, the faint echoes of battles lost to time. The forgotten gladiators were not nameless to themselves. In their hearts, they carried their own stories. And in the quiet corners of history, if we listen carefully, we can still hear them. Closing reflections, the Roman Colosseum stands today as a crumbling monument, a silent witness to centuries of blood, ambition, corruption, and spectacle. It has survived fires, earthquakes, wars, and time itself. But the stories it once held have scattered like dust across the centuries. The unfair matches of the Roman Colosseum reveal a side of history we don't often see. They remind us that the grandeur we celebrate was built on suffering, that the cheers of the crowd often drowned out the pleas of the powerless, and that not every battle was fought on equal ground. The games were not just shows. They were reflections of the empire itself, its power, its cruelty, its obsessions, and its fears. They fed the people's thirst for excitement, but also served to pacify, distract, and control them. The Colosseum was both a gift and a cage, and perhaps that's why its story endures. For within its cracked stones, we can still hear the echoes of the condemned, the roars of beasts, the clash of steel, and the chant of a crowd that demanded more. History remembers the emperors, the victorious gladiators, and the grand spectacles. But we should also remember the forgotten ones, the prisoners thrown to the lions, the nameless fighters who never stood a chance, the animals dragged from distant lands to die for sport, and the men and women whose stories were swallowed by the sands. The unfair matches were not accidents. They were carefully constructed, deliberately staged, and deeply woven into the politics, the economics, and the psychology of Roman life. In the end, the Colosseum is not just a story about ancient Rome, it is a story about us, about what we cheer for, what we ignore, what we excuse, and what we forget. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, remember, sometimes history's loudest voices are not those who survived, but those who were never heard.